Thanks a lot. We wish we could be there in Maribor with you instead of sitting in office in London for so long and not moving. But thanks for the invitation.
We really missed those exchanges with people in the conference and also with the people, all the people watching. So also the chance to exchange in person. But hopefully there'll be another chance soon for everybody. So the fast-moving climate drama in which we are all caught up is expressed through the superlatives of fiercest fires, thinnest ice caps, fastest extinctions, and hottest temperatures since the end of the Ice Age. 10 years ago, Rob Nixon famously described environmental crisis and its impacts on deprived communities as slow violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, drawing attention to the incremental deterioration of the conditions of life. Today, with 19 of the 20th hottest years ever recorded in the new millennium, and a vast digital surveillance apparatus measuring environmental change in real time, most palpably in the melting of polar ice sheets, we now know that climate disaster and the violence of its multiple impacts are actually happening at a super fast rate. It's also clear that climate change is not only changing weather patterns and causing global warming, but is interlinked with the emergencies of species extinction, soil erosion, deforestation, air pollution, ocean acidification, and still more. Equally, ecological change and ecological crisis is inextricably linked to the deepening of social injustice and therefore demands that we take into account indigenous, global south, post-socialist and beyond human perspectives.
How can the history of Maribor eco-triennial be chronicled in terms of history of ice? What could be the overlaps between the cultural and environmental histories of this ecological art event? The opening sentence in the catalogue of the first Yugoslav triennial of ecology and art in 1980 reveals that the curatorial intention was to show how contemporary artists think about the suicidal relation of today's society to its own environment. The triennial, which was held on the occasion of the National Holiday of Republic, demonstrated that in the Yugoslav context, it was possible to make such bold statements and express the gravity of ecological crisis so clearly as suicidal. It was quite different in other socialist states at the time, where the official policy was that ecological crisis could not exist under socialism, as only capitalism can produce environmental problems. This suggests an unlikely convergence between today's understanding that colonial and extractivist capitalist system is the primary cause of climate change and the propagandistic claims of official socialist ideology that laid blame at the door of capitalism. The Yugoslav example and the history of eco-triennial complicates this narrative by indicating that ecological crisis was planetary and that the socialist system was deeply implicated as well.
I'm going to share the screen. In terms of the environmental history, we could look at the works, for example, of the work Extopia from 2017 by the Slovenian duo Plateau Residue, which dealt with the vulnerable state of the tree-clad glacier in the Julian Alps that has shrunk in size from 36 to just 1 hectare over the course of 70 years. So the artists invited a group of participants to gather on the mountain top and undertake a series of actions designed to awaken their receptivity to the vanishing glacier. The film records 8 individuals going through a sequence of listening to a short intervention about ecological interconnectedness and human responsibility in a kind of yurt-like camouflage tent before putting on a ghillie suit to amplify their sense of merging with the environment and setting off to immerse themselves in the postglacial landscape.
Of our particular interest is the sequence with one interviewee who recalled how in 1980s there was actually an attempt by the local authorities to protect the glacier by banning the construction of ski lifts and restricting skiing on its surface. Whereas 40 years ago, there was enough ice to consider turning it into ski run. Today, as the informant put it, you need microscope to find it. So at the time of the first Maribor triennial, debates were raging about how to protect the environment of the glacier from touristic development. But as we speak, and with the new edition of the triennial relaunching, the situation with the Cryosphere has deteriorated to the extent that the Triglav Glacier has now shrunk so much that it is now considered a glacierette. Testifying to the momentousness of the effects of climate change, the interviewee in the film concluded that some things cannot be protected. This aptly identifies the absurdity of localized attempts of conservation in face of the global effects of climate disruption, while raising the question of how to protect the unprotectable and how to grasp the overwhelming impermanence that terrestrials experience nowadays.
So in 2015, Swedish artist Hanna Ljung filmed a group of geologists taking annual measurements on the glacier of the southern summit of the Kebnekaise mountain, which is the highest peak in Sweden. Entitled "I Am Mountain to Measure Impermanence," this 6-hour real-time footage of their scientific research was recorded with a camera which was set on the rocky north summit. Observing from a distance the small human figures on the ridge of this white mountainous landscape against a scene of ominously passing grey clouds. Measurements have actually been made at this location since 1902, and evidence was mounting that the glacier was shrinking, with the likelihood that the ice-free northern summit at 2,096 meters and 80 centimeters would soon take over as the highest point in the country. In fact, the glacier shrunk by 24 meters in 25 years, and by September 2019, this scenario had become a reality.
In her practice, Ljung has also reflected on the minerals and metals such as iron, zinc, and copper that are extracted from mountains and which are the same chemical elements that constitute the building blocks of the human body. She has made sculpture from the exact amount of a particular metal that are present in an individual body, or, as in the case of this copper sculpture, in the population of whole town, making connections between the materiality of the body and the extractive operations of mineral mining. In that sense, as indicated by the title of the film, I Am Mountain, she personalized and internalized the geological changes to the mountain to which we are physically linked, but which is being transformed by anthropogenic intrusions that bring about a planetary sense of impermanence, as she claims.
So the socialist histories of mineral extraction and the social and cultural infrastructures that were built to service fossil fuel economies are starkly visible in the relics of the former Soviet coal mining town of Pyramiden on the Svalbard archipelago, which was investigated by Latvian artist Ieva Epnere in her film Four Edges of Pyramiden. Nostalgia for a lost golden age is expressed by shots of the deserted pathways of a settlement that was at its height in the 1980s, home to 1,000 people and equipped with a library, cultural centre, swimming pool, self-service restaurant, and of course a Lenin monument. Today, as temperatures on Svalbard rise twice as fast as the global average and its permafrost rapidly retreats, the prospect of easy access to polar mineral wealth has made the revival of the Soviet ghost town a strategic interest of the Russian state, which seeks to maintain and expand rights to exploit the region's mineral wealth that were guaranteed by the Treaty of Svalbard in 1920. Yet, as the film suggests, for its inhabitants, it's not the fading relics of Soviet power, but rather the disappearance of entities of the natural world that makes them feel so privileged to live on the island. The hotel cook, for instance, whose family back in Ukraine cannot understand her attachment to this barren place, relates in the film her experience of something vast, unfathomable, and extremely beautiful when she realized that the glacier has been there for 1 million years and I'm touching it with my hands.
Indigenous communities on the front line of global warming are registering the disruption of natural cycles and patterns in their daily lives. Inuit artist collective Isuma's film Kapirangayuk, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, gave voice to the experience of elders from across Canadian Arctic archipelago who describe effects such as the disappearance of blue and solid multi-year ice that behaves like living beings, and reduction of directional tongue drifts in the snow as the wind blows now from east, not the north. After the world tilted, as one hunter comments, the sun rays hit more directly and the stars are no longer in the right position, while visual distortion brought on by frequent mirages forces fishermen to adapt traditional techniques and spear strangely, which is the Inuit term for which provides the title of the film. So this is the portrayal of the world out of cosmic balance.
For the climate imaginary of the present day, glaciers signal extreme vulnerability to global warming, with the carving of ice sheets into Arctic seas heralding worldwide coastal flooding, and the disappearance of seasonal melts from the Himalayas to the Andes, threatening fresh water supplies as rivers run dry. In earlier times, especially during the so-called Little Ice Age of the early 19th century, ice worlds figured as inhospitable alien terrain, and glaciers as sublime natural forces that had the power to encroach on civilized realms. In the film, we are opposite like that. London and Delhi-based artist Himali Singh Soin contrasted the climate uncertainty of today's era of receding ice sheets with the opposite anxiety of the Victorians that advancing ice would obliterate familiar landscapes. By annotating period drawings of frozen seas to reveal the, quote, illusion of ice as a looming cosmic monster that sends shudders across the British Empire, the artist also suggested correspondences with the late imperialist fear of losing political and cultural supremacy. Another recurring presence in the film is an otherworldly figure wrapped in silver foil who emerges from a block of ice to narrate a story about her non-human origins in a fossilized past. The artist, whose name Himali significantly means daughter of the snow, devises fictional mythologies for polar landscapes transformed by climate change, while drawing attention to the potential erasure of memories of ice in a post-glacial future.
We want to stay for a moment with the idea of the anxiety about encroaching ice in the Victorian era, which could be also detected in the appeal of glacial sublime to 19th century artists who journeyed to the Alps to witness the advancing ice sheets. Turner visited Mer de Glace in the Chamonix Valley, the largest glacier in France, at the beginning of the 19th century, and his journey was retraced by English artist and critic John Ruskin in 1854, capturing awe-inspiring natural spectacle of the Alpine Sea of Ice. Today, the glacial landscape they depicted is much diminished as the Mer de Glace has retreated 2 kilometers since the mid-19th century, another stark evidence of the dramatic effects of climate breakdown on the highest and coldest places on the Earth.
So it turns out it wasn't really a random or unique journey that took Ruskin to the Alps, since there is a whole history encoded in the Swiss Alps of British imperialism, of habits and presumptions of privilege based on wealth gained through colonial violence. There are also physical relics, not completely unlike the Soviet infrastructures on Svalbard, of the architectures of colonial expansion into the natural environment of the Alps. Here in the middle of the image you can see is apparently the house that Winston Churchill used to holiday in for several years. And we actually saw this house from a viewing platform near a hotel on the opposite ridge, which itself dates also to this heyday of these particular histories, having been founded in 1858, built in 1858. And we were there to encounter the Aletsch Glacier, the largest in Switzerland, as part of a week-long series of workshops and seminars on art and ecology. This research excursion was also intended as a way to provoke a situated and embodied experience of the issues addressed in the meetings. This is a view of the Aletsch Glacier, which in the 19th century extended much further down the valley. In fact, the expansion of the glacier was a source of mortal fear for local villagers, who, as local artist Severin Gulper told the group, sent a delegation to Rome to ask the Pope to pray for the retreat of the glacier. Apparently, a few years ago, the same village went again to ask the Pope to reverse the process.
In his own work, as he showed us in an impromptu shallow presentation, Guelph also looks at the potential to reactivate communities and the potential histories of grassroots democracy when political representatives have for decades failed miserably to take decisive and meaningful action on climate change. His Matza Manifesto borrowed its name from the local alpine tradition that centered on a tree trunk carried around villages in the Upper Valley region to voice common concerns, agreement upon which was expressed by hammering a nail into a tree trunk as a sign of support. This was also the starting point for a series of situated art science encounters at sites of climate breakdown, including the shrinking ice of the Aletsch Glacier itself. As part of our workshop, we also visited the local or the regional museum in Vale, where amongst the exhibits was another 19th century etching of the Aletsch Glacier, which was then at its prime. And this is how the museum addressed the current moment of climate change. The climate chefs have completed their recipe and the glacier soup is ready. So this culinary metaphor is something to really think about.
The idea of climate chefs also brings to mind Western views of domination over natural processes and the scientific creed that technology will one day enable the climate to be turned up and down like a planetary thermostat. Polish artist Steiner Lelonek addressed the case of the Rhone Glacier, infamous for the fact that Swiss villagers whose livelihoods depend on tourism have attempted to protect a historic ice grotto from the warming climate by covering it with white blankets every summer. This could be seen as a low-tech version of the good Anthropocene approach to climate change, with proposals such as covering glaciers with artificial snow or using giant pumps to refreeze Arctic ice put forward by the advocates of geoengineering solutions to environmental crisis. While the weathered sheets get torn apart by the wind, these localized efforts to protect the Rhone Glacier are profoundly futile in the face of rapid ice retreat. Leilonek's multi-channel sound installation, Melting Gallery, realized in collaboration with Swiss sound artist and composer Denim Stram, filled the exhibition space with undulating yet persistent sound of ice loss. The disconcerting melody of this glacial composition brings home the fact that many of the planet's permafrost places have already passed the tipping point, and, as the artist put it, are facing a slowly trickling catastrophe.
Now, the slowly trickling catastrophe or the fast violence of the shrinking of the cryosphere is compounded by the fact that so-called permafrost melts. It releases vast quantities of carbon, the originating vegetation that absorbed it from the air centuries ago, but froze before it could decompose. Much of this organic material is being released back into the atmosphere as frozen regions thaw, constituting one of the unpredictable feedback loops that threaten to push the climate towards the tipping point faster than anticipating in most climate change summit scenarios. The loss of ice is also not only about how human communities are affected, but how ecosystems, whole ecosystems, animals, lichens, trees, and microorganisms are endangered, and how it impacts the glacier itself as a terrestrial entity.
Concert for Odishi Glacier was performed by Slovak artist Otto Hudec on the Caucasian mountain, in which he played his guitar one-on-one to the ice itself in an intimate sonic exchange with this non-human entity towering above. Plants growing in the soil laid bare by the retreating ice indicate nature's resilience, yet they also raise the question whether the threat to biodiversity from climate change affects not only species but also natural entities. Hudec's performance was an empathic gesture that recognizes the entangled fates of humans, animals, plants, and other living organisms, as well as the physical forces and natural phenomena of the Earth. Care for glaciers is also manifest in a reassessment of anthropocentric constitutional concepts, such as through the extending of legal personhood to Patagonian glaciers by the Argentinian Congress in 2010. The true political gravity of such legal gestures lies in the fact that in order to provide meaningful protection of the rights of vulnerable glaciers, a radical reconfiguration of the global economic and political order fueling climate change is required.
Due to their role in the function of ecosystem and within world cultures, the frozen water bodies of the cryosphere cannot be fully understood in narrowly scientific terms, with the indigenous people of the formerly frozen north experiencing their melting most intensely as a dislocation of the cosmic order. At the same time, extractive capitalism seeks short-term economic advantage in the melting of the polar ice caps, holding out the panacea of geoengineering solution to glacier melt rather than dealing with its systemic causes. Performing empathic gestures of care towards these planetary entities, artists have investigated the dire prospect and rapidly approaching collective trauma of world without ice. In mounting a defense of glaciers from a fate that is in all likelihood already sealed, we can take a lead from artists to uncover the ecological potentialities of the entangled histories of the terrestrials and ice.
Thank you.